Today's video review segment is I'm trying to hit first on some things that there's been a lot of people ask for some questions and some review of. And I want to talk about Wilbur Zelinsky today. But before we do that, I want to recap some questions I asked you on Friday. I think it was when we did the Ravenstein review. And so if you've not watched the Ravenstein review, for whatever reason, I would go back. I actually would watch that one, then watch this one, and they would be good to watch back to back too. I left you with some questions about Ravenstein, and one of the questions I left you with to ponder and to use as a study tool was what concepts / terms does Ravenstein are incorporated inside of Ravenstein's ideas about why people move. And I wanted to kind of go back now and see, hopefully you did that work. And this, guys, that's the whole idea for success right now. You've got to self-motivate. You've got to be disciplined enough to do that work and practice that just like it was an FRQ. So I'm going to give you some of my answers, and you may have more, and you may want to share those and say, hey, would this be right? Obviously, one type of migration that is very evident in Ravenstein's model is step migration. I mean, one of his 11 rules of migration is that people will move in successive steps. So that's definitely one. Another one that's very present in Ravenstein's model, a concept, is the gravity model, because every part of the gravity model is in Ravenstein's model. Two different rules. Number one, the gravity model is about interactions between places, considering distance and size of the two places' populations. Number one, Ravenstein says that two places close together are likely to be more connected because he anticipates that people move short distances most of the time. The gravity model agrees with that. But Ravenstein also says that if you're going to move a long distance, you're going to move to a heavily populated city. That's the other caveat of the gravity model, is that bigger cities are more connected. So the gravity model is all about what Ravenstein is saying. You could also potentially say that Ravenstein incorporates the idea of contagious diffusion because of places nearby being a draw. You also could talk about how Ravenstein incorporates hierarchical diffusion, because hierarchical diffusion is with the idea that you're going to move to big cities before you move to other places more than likely. And then, of course, Ravenstein discusses push and pull factors throughout all of his laws. Some other terms that are very evident in Ravenstein to me are distance decay. I think I mentioned that the other day. And then, while maybe not incorporated not directly in Ravenstein's model, it would be a good place to then talk about, okay, so Ravenstein basically does believe in distance decay from about 200 years ago. So what about time-space convergence and globalization? And is distance decay as important as it used to be? If people move in 2020, are they more or less likely to move a long distance? And then I think you bring in time-space convergence, the compressing of time thanks to technological improvements. But now check yourself. Who's had more technological improvements? So is a person in Zimbabwe or Colorado more likely to make a long move? And there's a gold mine of stuff you can review right there. That's what I want to get you doing. These review sessions are not designed to answer every question for you. These review sessions are designed to remind you of things and then to hopefully make you think, oh, I could study it that way. Oh, I need to think about what about this scenario? What about that scenario? That's what I'm trying to design these to do. Another term that is very much in Ravenstein is the term of urbanization, the growth of the city, and how people will often move from the country to the city, which connects us to Zelinsky today as well. And you can make connections of Zelinsky to Ravenstein. So those are some of the most prominent, I'm sure there's more, that's not an exclusive list, prominent terms and concepts found in Ravenstein's 11 laws of migration, I should say. What I wanted to do today is also introduce you, or not introduce, but reintroduce you to Zelinsky. He is one that many of you have had trouble with. You might remember that Zelinsky is basically saying, Zelinsky basically said, yes, we've got the demographic transition model, which predicts what's going to happen in a country's population, birth rate, death rate, natural increase over a period of its growth in time and its evolution. Zelinsky says he could take that same model, basically, take the same idea, 4 stages, and explain migration. And what Zelinsky basically would say in stage 1, there's a lot of movement, but it's inside, internal, in the state. And then as you go through 2, 3, and 4, there's a change of the scope of movement of people. I posed a question, because sometimes posing a question is the best way to make you think. And if you want to pause this video and see if you can answer this as part of an FRQ, that would be great practice. That's up to you right now. But how would Zelinsky relate to the modern day immigration between Guatemala, Mexico, and the United States? Now, how would I answer that? The very first thing that I would do is I would say Zelinsky's trying to relate movement to stages. So I would always, because I'm a big believer in know the DTM and know the stages, and you can always use it. So I'm going to figure out, do I know the stages of all these 3 countries? I know the U.S. is a 4. I know Mexico is a relatively mid-range 3. I know that Guatemala is likely an early 3 or maybe a late 2. I think it's more of an early 3 if I remember the numbers correctly. So does that help me? It should, if you know Zelinsky. But that's where we do have to know Zelinsky. So how do we know that? You need to review. Go back to OneNote, demography, content library, and look at the Zelinsky page, the notes from January the 27th. And there's 2 things that are very good for help here. There is this slide out of a textbook that graphs what Zelinsky thinks will happen about rural migrations. Like the green line on this graph represents people moving back and forth, enter within rural areas. It is really high. The curve kind of reaches its high point, apex, in stage 1. Because everybody lives in rural areas. They're nomadic herders. They're hunting and gathering. That disappears by stage 3, because if you're moving by stage 3, you're probably not moving from country to country, from rural area to rural area. Then the purple line represents rural to urban movement, which isn't going to happen in stage 1 because there isn't any urban. It starts happening in stage 2, and notice where it peaks. It peaks between 2 and 3. And then the curve, it's still happening in 3, but at a slower rate. And then by 4, it kind of levels off. It doesn't go all the way down to 0, but it kind of levels off. Think about why. Again, urban doesn't really show up until stage 2 and then becomes more of a center of commerce by stage 3. Interurban, from one urban area to another. You don't see any of it until stage 2, basically, because there's no urban areas. And then you don't see much of it really until you get to stage 3 when there's more urban areas. In stage 2, there's usually a handful. But by stage 4, there's a lot of big urban areas. So you basically have an S curve created with the interurban graphic. And then lastly, from urban to rural. You're not going to see that hardly at all until stage 3, because there was no urban in stage 1. There was the start of urban in stage 2, and this is where a lot of jobs were created and people were moving to, not away from. And so in stage 3, and especially late 3 and early 4, some people might want to leave the city, especially older people, for a more quiet lifestyle. All right. That is a great, if you can't understand this diagram, it's terrific. Then there are some loopholes. There's something missing, some gaps in your understanding of Zelinsky. So think about that. And then go down to this chart, which is in your textbook as well, that overviews Zelinsky. And I'm not going to reteach this. You can read this as well as I can. Stage 1, everybody's moving every day, but short distance. Stage 2, your domestic migration, inside, internal, is from usually rural to urban. And people start immigrating, exiting out of your country to likely a country of a higher stage where they may be able to make more money. Then in stage 3, you begin to see the opposite of an immigration. You're still seeing some movement to the cities, according to Zelinsky, but you're also still seeing suburban movement as well. And then he says by stage 4, it's basically the same as 3, with more internal urban to urban migration. So he admits that 3 and 4 can look a lot alike. You want to freeze this right here, study this chart, look at your textbook. Those are just things you have to understand. Now, obviously, on the test this year, if you had to look this up, you could. But you want to know it well enough that you would, if you had to look it up, you just wanted to do it as a quick reminder, okay? What they're going to want you to do, likely, is answer questions like I'm posing here. What's the relationship? Well, the U.S. is a stage 4. So should the U.S. draw immigration from other countries that are maybe less developed? Would Zelinsky suggest that the movement from Guatemala to Mexico, or I'm sorry, would Zelinsky suggest the movement from Guatemala to the U.S. is of a greater likelihood right now than Mexico to the U.S.? The answer is yes. Now, this is a model. Models are going to be wrong. He doesn't take into effect how close the countries are, Mexico bordering the U.S. and Guatemala. Guatemala not bordering the U.S. But if you remember, we have studied the rate of immigration from Guatemala to the U.S. is higher now, much higher than it was 10 years ago. And the rate from Mexico is going down as Mexico has entered a later stage 3. So in a sense, Zelinsky is predicting some things right in that Guatemalans are more likely to be leaving these days to head to Mexico. That's definitely possibility. Late stage 2, early 3 to later stage 3, or from Guatemala to the U.S., stage 4 country, or using step migration. Now we can use Zelinsky and Ravenstein first to Mexico and then to the U.S. Guys, this is incredible review material right here. This is the thinking process that I believe they're going to put you through on the exam. Know the models and ideas well enough to make them applicable. Now, is Zelinsky perfect? Absolutely not. Zelinsky doesn't take into effect, again, distance very much really at all. He's talking about stages. So if you've got a stage 3 country and a stage 4 country in one part of the world right next to each other, there's probably going to be more out immigration from that 3 than Zelinsky would predict. Like there's probably more out immigration from Mexico than today than Zelinsky would predict. Not literally today, but like in the modern age. Because the United States is next door. So there are impacts and factors. Zelinsky doesn't take into effect other things. Take a look at this. If I can get to the right slideshow here. Zelinsky does not take into effect this map. Look at this. Syria. Is there anything special that's been going on in Syria? And special, I don't mean in a good way. Zelinsky does not take into effect that a civil war might change everything. Yes, Syria is a, early 3 maybe, late 2, so they should have out-migration. But they have out-migration at a level not even fathomable. Whereas you can tell where they're going to. Most of them are going to nearby countries. And remember, you can then click on any country you want to on this map to see where people are coming to and going from. Obviously, you see Turkey's got a lot of people coming in. Turkey's not a stage 4, it's a 3. But the Syria situation is making that very unique for Turkey, okay? Then we can light everything back up again. We can look at some places in sub-Saharan Africa that have in-migration, okay? Why? Is it because they're really advanced? Do they meet Zelinsky's stage 4? Maybe not. Maybe the reason is that the countries around them are so poor, people are looking for the next best opportunity. So that a Nigeria, which is doing better than most, is drawing more in-migration even as it's a late stage 2. This is where, again, you should criticize Zelinsky and say, here's a way Zelinsky is wrong. Look at Nigeria. It is a stage 2, but it is getting more in-migration right now than it's not much more, but a little bit more. Do the demographic accounting equation, and you figure out if you get a plus or minus, remember? But it has more in than out because of the poorer countries around it. They're losing people to the U.S. and to Britain, but Nigeria, English speaking, remember that, lingua franca, but they're gaining people from all the countries around them. This is the kind of thinking you need to do. Now, I hope you can take this map. This is in the demographic The migration interactives map, it's called metrocosm.com. You see the URL up there, global-migration-map.html. Great study tool. I could go through thousands of examples on here. I don't really have the time to do that. And you can do them just as well on your own. If you run into problems, bring them up. This may be something we use the Zooms for as well. So hopefully this has been beneficial. Where does Zelinsky work? What did he say? How has he been wrong in certain circumstances? Maybe a good question is, discuss 2 examples in the world where Zelinsky can be proven partly wrong. Discuss 2 examples in the world where Zelinsky could be right, or maybe within one example of migration from this country to this country, Zelinsky could be partially right and partially wrong, because the world is more complicated than models and theories. Remember what models and theories do. They simplify the world so we can understand it better. I'll wrap up with this. You've probably heard on the newscast, whether you wanted to or not, some discussion of models of the coronavirus. And I heard a great interview the other day where a doctor said, let's try to educate people here. He said, understand that models are going to be wrong. And some people, I think, are probably shocked by that. Models are computer, logarithms, equations, in the case of science and epidemiology and stuff like that. Same thing in geography. Models are just meant to simplify. But when you simplify the complex, you're going to have mistakes and errors. It's like map projections. They're simplifying the complex. They all lie. All models will tell a lie about the future. And this doctor made that point. He said, yes, fortunately, the models have been incredibly wrong in a good way for us, that this virus has not did more damage than it has. And there were some things that they need to go back and adjust because they were predicting almost the unpredictable, because this was nothing like they'd quite seen before. They'd seen things similar, but not quite similar. Same thing in geography. Use that to help you understand. Please study this, use these resources, and we'll review more later on.